are the first person that your business reach out in terms of feasibility, in terms of effort, and your answers shape the whole future of that product.
As an architect, for me, that is what I care the most about. I want to see who's using the system, how they're using it, what is working, what is not, what is failing, at what point.
It's like my happy place if I had to start from scratch, like a green field application development where I can pick shiny tools together. But that's not always the case.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to another Tech Chronicles podcast. Today's episode is all about learning about software architecture. Our topic is a day in the life of an architect. We thought of bringing this topic up because we get asked from our junior engineers all the time, what do you do? What does an architect do? Why do you need an architect? So this is for all you aspiring architects or newly promoted architects. We want to talk about tools and techniques you can learn and pick up to be a great architect, your function with management and stakeholders, your function with other tech teams, and other things you need to do in your day-to-day life to be a great one. Shall we get started? All right, who wants to kick us off?
All right, if it's okay, I'll start with my viewpoints. So I think we'll talk about these skills, techniques in random, not in any specific order. I like to take one of the primary functions, which is coming up with the technical design, the owning the technical design of your product that is built or to be built. And then most of the time, tech design is seen as drawing few boxes, connecting lines, and some sort of representation or a sequence diagram or some diagram. Or in certain cases, it's a written text saying these are the capabilities that you need. What does this really mean? If you really dig down, for me, a system design is a series of decisions that you make. You make a decision to use component A versus component B, technology A versus technology B. And you have to make these decisions, and all your decisions will have repercussions in the days to come. That's where a good versus suboptimal architecture is decided. Most of the time, it's not decided then and there. Everything looks good at the beginning. Your decisions look good. But later you realize whether those decisions are good or bad based on how the application perform. So I'll get back to how you can make these decisions, or how you can sort of validate decisions later, but that's a beginning for me. System design as a core function, and system design is a series of decisions that you make. What are your thoughts?
I can maybe add my spin on it. So if you take a software project, this is the way I think of it. Okay, if you take a software project, you have two leaders. There's your engineering manager who manages the people and the resources, timelines, and stuff around it. And you have a technical leader that manages exactly what you said, making the technical decisions, the trade offs of those decisions, understanding the risks and assumptions you make so that you deliver an outcome, a business outcome. That technical leader is your architect. And think of it like this: if your organization's technical story is a jigsaw puzzle, there are a lot of holes. The architect's role is to figure out what are the pieces that fit well with the rest of the organization and make sure that it seamlessly integrates and adds value overall to the company, such that it lives on for 5 years or something like that, and it's easily extendable without having to rewrite stuff. We've heard all horror stories, right? That is my, you know, 50,000-foot view of an architect.
I love your analogy about the jigsaw puzzle. I just wanted to throw another dimension to it. There's also moving parts, right? It's not a steady jigsaw puzzle. So you have to, as an architect, need to know, okay, this is going to be in time somewhere in 2 quarters down the line, or this might be there in 2 years. So it's also the journey, also trying to manage a big picture. So because as an architect, you hold the big picture, right? You are responsible for the big picture. So if things don't converge the way you envision, that's going to be a problem. So, with that said, I also wanted to, for the audience, kind of distinguish the different types of architect roles that exist. There is enterprise architect, there is solutions architect, and technical architect. Full disclosure, I played only enterprise architecture and solutions. But I can say that enterprise architecture is probably more distant to solutions and technical architect than the solutions and technical architect, because the enterprise architect mainly is interested in organizational direction, whereas the solutions and technical, they have a business problem to solve. So with that, Puresh, you wanna?
Sure, yeah. No, that was like definitely like a great point to all the other great points that was brought up. Just to kind of echo on that, and I'll go to a couple of other points. If you look at across like an enterprise architect to like a solution architect to like a technical architect, and if you kind of lay it out on a 2D graph, right? Where like your y-axis is more strategy, your x-axis is more technical, or like the development of like the system. Like your enterprise kind of sits on like the top left. Solution architect kind of sits in that middle, like it's like a perfect cross section, and the technical architect is on the more bottom right, where their focus is more on the solution. Also, if you take any type of like a software project, you have obviously like it fits into some kind of like a life cycle, right? And the architect role is one of the few that is there from day one to day like the last day, or like beyond like the last day, right? There's like these various teams, various types of roles kind of get rolled on like part of like the life cycle. But like either like one architect or like a multiple flavors of like whatever that architecture role or the roles are, like a group of resources that kind of stays within like the entire life cycle of like a software solution.
Well, shall we, for the benefit of our viewers, shall we go through the software development life cycle and talk about the expectations of an architect in each of those steps? Would you like to kick us off, Anjana?
Yeah, so I'll start with the inception where you're thinking of the analysis of the problem. You're figuring out what needs to be done. What we generally call the discovery phases. Like you're discovering the functional requirements. You're discovering the product type and things like that. Right. So that's a stage where the architect can bring a lot. You can bring the perspective of first the feasibility from a technology point of view. All what you are visualizing, can they be translated into a technical service or a product? So that's a very good input an architect can provide at that point of time. And also architect can bring a perspective of the development time estimate at a very high level. When you start a project, you might not even have a full technical team to do a full estimate, but your go-to person is the architect. An architect is most likely is a engineer with experience, so you can't just get rid of that part. That's another important skill to have. Your architect is a person who has engineer with experience, or a technical person with experience who's become a system designer, system advocate of a technology or a specific domain. So you're the first person that your business reach out in terms of feasibility, in terms of effort, and your answers uh, shape the whole future of that product. So that's the stage that you get involved at a very high level. What are your thoughts?
Starting with, like Anjana was saying, we do the discovery and framing. That is very important because that's when we bring in the product owner, the different roles together. And architect's responsibility is to basically try to try to solve it in our mind as we are talking about problems. And the architect's role is to ask the right questions, things like what is the goal, anti-goals, like guiding principles, try to frame it in a manner that you can start blueprinting the solution next. And when we start doing that, we identify what are the technology and tool choices we have at the enterprise level. So that'll be a good starting point.
Yeah, Agree with both of you. What is important is you have a seat at the table right from the very beginning. So it's a very responsible role. I don't have anything to add to the inception phase.
So the design phase, that's naturally what our architect is for. Now, this is a interesting phase, even though we call it design. With my experience, there are two parts to it. One is the static design. You draw boxes and you say connectivity between these boxes, that your static design. But the hardest part to visualize is the runtime design. I'll explain what that runtime design means. So a static design, you have a web application connecting to a database. In between, there's a caching. Three layers like a web app, caching layer, and a DB layer. Simple, very static design. The runtime design is when you actually put this into production, every system will break at some point, right? That's a given. Database will break at a certain parallel connections. Your caching will go out once you hit the ramp. Web server will run out of connections. What really happens during runtime is a mystery. Anything could happen. Now, as an architect, how do you deal with this runtime bill? That's where the complication comes to play. Yes, you have layered, but as soon as you go to production on certain days, system becomes slower, something breaks up. How do you solve that problem? That's where you need to bring your experience of your past life as an engineer, as a deployment expert, as a person who has monitored these systems, so that you know what could happen during runtime and then take measures for that. And that's a very important element of system design. Think of the static view as well as the runtime view.
I would add on a few more things, right, to what you said. Anjan, you said sometimes you need to lean on your experience. This is the best part actually of being an architect, the creative aspect, right? Coming up with a creative solution to solve this business problem. I feel in addition to experience, I feel this is where, and as an architect, you need to learn from your peers, learn from other companies, read papers of what went right, what went wrong, because sometimes you don't have enough time to make these mistakes or have this experience. You got to absorb all this information around you, go to conferences. I think all of that add to your value, right? Because when you are designing something, architecting something, you can incorporate all these little pieces in there.
Yeah, that's a great point. Something to add to that, and then probably Yuresh will take it from there. So one thing is your experience, learning, reaching out to people. That's one angle, right? That's all the knowledge that you have access to. But there are situations you don't have access to that knowledge for some reason. You don't even know the right keyword to search. There are situations like that. That's a completely great. That's where you come up with a POC. You do a thin slice. You build something. You learn that by doing it.
So one aspect I would kind of bring out as an architect is like, as I mentioned earlier, an architect kind of like stays within like the entire span of the conversations, like all the meetings, all the discussions, all the decisions, whatnot, right? I think like one of the clear transition points, it goes from like the requirement to like the design phase is, I think Anjana kind of mentioned this too, around like your capabilities and like the components part, right? Like, so you would have like end up, whether it's documented that way or not, like you would have like some level of like a capability matrix. You would take that and kind of structure it into like a more logical structure, right? That logical view would kind of explain out of like your, I don't know, X amount of capabilities, 1, 2, and 5 capabilities would fall under this logical component, right? Then you start kind of overlaying your technologies to say like these capabilities are going to get served by these technologies or this technology. This is when like a lot of other conversations kind of come into picture as an architect, that you had to drive these conversations. Like in a different episode, we have talked about this, like build versus buy decisions, or like what technology components are you going to use. Like this is like where your past experiences come into picture. You would want to POC something out, right? Like you have like two candidates, like which one is going to perform better. And also like on another episode, we also talked about like referring to like reference architectures, right? So all that kind of concepts kind of come into picture, and then you kind of start building, iterating, and then kind of building it out in a way that like you kind of come up with like that entire architecture design as part of like your technical design. Just a quick message to our viewers. If you'd like to tune into like these types of interesting topics, you can follow us on our channel. Hit that subscribe on the YouTube channel right now so that you can stay up to date.
I wanted to follow up. That's a very good point. One thing we didn't probably set the stage there is that sometimes as an architect, it's like my happy place if I had to start from scratch, like a greenfield application development where I can pick shiny tools together. But that's not always the case. Sometimes you have to, enhance an existing antiquated system to a new one, which poses a lot of challenges. First of all, like as an architect, you also need to convince the business that the new platform is going to perform better than what it is. For me personally, that was one of the biggest challenges I had, was that there was this multi tens of millions dollar generating machine that nobody wanted to touch, but it was costing us a lot of money. And my task was to basically implement a strangler pattern with the new technology to get them over to cloud. So that was a massive journey. Like you have to start to Eurasia's point and others' point as well. Start to actually implementing measures that you can actually show that it is performing. Otherwise, people would not believe.
That leads to another dimension. As an architect, what soft skills you need to have. This is something we can go into a lot of details, but I'll start with on the skill of negotiation. So this is something most of the architects that I have worked with, they don't take it seriously, and this is one reason sometimes they can't deliver their message. You need to have that skill of negotiating. It's not about asking for more time. That could be one of those areas. The other part is, how do you build a very logical conversation and bring the perspective, and also empathize it from a business perspective, understand it from a business perspective, understand it from a restrictions that you have. Restrictions are real, right? You have a team of .NET engineers, and it makes sense to build something on .NET unless you make a larger decision to let them go, or you have to work in a onshore offshore model where you can't have everyone in a single room to do a design discussion. Those restrictions are real, right? And how do you play around it? How do you play with those constraints? And how do you communicate in the right fashion so that people get convinced? Because as a technical architect or a solution, or as an in general architect, you can't stamp your authority. You can't simply say, I design, you develop. That's never going to work, right? From the junior engineer, intern in the team, to all the way to a C-level employee, you need to convince and get them to believe, not just religiously, but with logics and facts. And that's a form of very clear articulation skill. And it has to be clear in your head first, and then transfer that into everyone else. And I keep telling this to junior architects or people who are starting. Self-belief is important. First, you have to be 100% convinced, or not 100%, or you have to be really convinced that you have brought something right into this mix, and then start communicating that. That's how I look at it. So that's a very important skill of negotiation, a skill of articulation, skill of convincing people. Those are really required for an architect to be successful.
Echo everything you said, 100% true. All right, shall we move on to the role of an architect during implementation?
Yes, I think in my view, this is where you need to start thinking of the organization, the business, little bit more. The reason I bring that perspective is during this implementation deployment is where you spend a lot of money on infrastructure. And if you don't plan it well, you would spend more than what you really need. So how do you minimize that? Is I think one primary responsibility of an architect at that point of time. I would start with a capacity plan. I would start with some sort of calculations. I would start with understanding the capacities and the different peaks, and then design certain scaling up as well as scaling down techniques around that. What are your thoughts on that?
If you are like a more services company, the journey is somewhat different. So just a few examples to bring out, right? Like, so I think we kind of started with like some capacity and like resource planning, right? Like outside of like the team structure, even yes, like you are getting ready to implement or like implementing, how do you bring in various environments at which point? So you need to kind of have like a clear understanding of like what that roadmap is, right? On day one, you don't need to set up like all your dev, QA, staging, production type of environments, right? Like how do you kind of like stack that out? And then obviously, like if you are dealing with like another example is that if you are dealing with SaaS type of platforms in the mix, you have to schedule certain things in advance, right? Like if you are using some kind of third party sandbox type of environments, you need to schedule performance tests way in advance, get approvals, get like a window set up. I'm kind of jumping ahead like to like a performance step. But the point is that certain things are not necessarily set up for you in advance in a service software services setup, right? You would leverage your processes from how you typically run a project, but they are not necessarily set up for you. So you need to kind of plan for it. And obviously, like the resources are there too. Like the resource part, like the team part, does not necessarily fall under like the architect alone, but like architect has a significant role in that decision process or like kind of providing like some input to it. Like so, I would definitely kind of look at it from both those aspects to figure out like what you need to do and like to do it when.
Just to add to that, also, just one tiny point. You also need to work very closely with your product counterpart to identify incremental milestones. So you're constantly showing incremental value and forward progression, right? So I think that is very important as well.
Yeah, I wanted to say like amazing points, all three of you. Just to add on top of what Roshan was saying earlier about collaboration. That's key for an architect to actually, like, if someone's not collaborating and being like very arrogant, no one's gonna come to the architect. They're gonna build their own stuff. So it's about being warm and basically involving the team. And chances are that you're not going to be the only architect, right? Because you have to work with like network architect, data architect, and different teams. So unless you are a startup, um, then basically you need to understand they are all specialized in the areas and be an open mind to basically adapt what they are trying to say. And also the one additional thing is be available, right? That's going to be very hard in the implementation phase because you get pulled in all different ways, like saying, "Hey, I'm stuck here. What's happening?" And that's when you have to start, drawing up on your POCs and say, "Hey, this is how I did it. It worked." What do
This
you
is
guys
where
think?
it's very important to have that second chain of command because they are the ones who are going to be representing the different pieces that are being built, right?
Yeah,
Anything
so
else to add?
yeah, I had few points. So we talked about the difference between a product and services. I had the chance to be in both sides. So on the services world, you kind of end your engagement, the first scope, with the hypercare. Go to production and a hypercare, like a very small period of time. Right? And if it's your own startup or a product, you keep going to production and you need to save a lot of time in that. So either way, you need to save time and you need to have a plan and a design. So that's where, as an architect, you need to gain skills and knowledge and at least work with DevOps teams. You understand what are more efficient ways of spinning off new servers. Like infrastructure as a code is a really great thing too. So when your architects having that idea and having taking advantage of that, you can save a lot of time. Like you can spin off a complete environment in a just click of a button. And then also your understanding of your view of the environments and how often you can go to these environments, how often you can go to production, and what automations that you can use, what tools and techniques that you have, and also how to scale down and when to scale down. All that is the in the DevOps sort of domain knowledge, and having that knowledge is quite important. One more point I would like to talk about is we talked about that as an architect, how do you govern it? Sometimes you can't go down to every job and look over the shoulder. You have to have a skill to govern from a distance. Like you dedicate your work is now dedicated, someone is doing it for you. And also you have to have some sort of control over what's being done. And how do you set up that, be it at the design phase or at a later stage? So that's, for me, it's two parts. One is the process that you bring to the place, and you sort of document things, you put a guideline, you help team start writing your own wiki, that part. The second part is you build a good relationship. I think Shan also touched upon that, right? That your relationship is built, it's a trust based relationship. You know, if there's something not right, that information comes to you and they come to you for advice, your opinion, and vice versa. So both that angles needs to be worked out. As a person, you are easy to work with, very easy to reach out to, and
Yeah.
you have very less judgment when someone brings up a problem. You're there to sort of be with them and solve the problem, then give your opinion. So you need to build that skill. Plus a process of, so that's where the people process comes to play, of the process of what to do, what not to do, sort of documentation and the knowledge share. Yeah, so I
Yeah,
think
let
those are
me
the two
add
that
another quick point to that, right? Like, so as you can see, like with everything we are saying, as an architect, the architect is in the center of like everything, right? Like you are bridging the gap between multiple teams. You are like the conduit. Like everyone would like come to you like with various questions, like looking for answers. So one thing you need to develop, which you will realize sooner than later, is the time management part, right? You are going to be like in constant meetings like throughout like the day. Like you need to kind of figure out like, okay, how do I carve out some time to actually do some design work? How do I carve out time to reply to like endless emails? So you need to kind of develop or build that skill alongside to manage. Otherwise you are going to get burnt out because you will you will feel you will feel it at some point that like you cannot like handle all this. So definitely delegation, like that Anjana kind of brought up, kind of comes into picture. Like you kind of have to kind of manage your day accordingly because everything is important. It's a matter of like priority at that.
Excellent point. Excellent point. We've kind of touched upon the deployment aspect as well. I just want to add a couple more things. Set up the team to deploy multiple times a day if possible. Gone are the days of, once a month deployments and all that kind of stuff, right? That's gone. That's old news. Be able to deploy with confidence, meaning if something does go wrong, everything's behind a feature flag. Practices are your friends. Evangelize that across all your teams, right? Use blue green deployments, all these techniques that are there at your disposal, use it, right? Metrics. Gosh, as an architect, for me, that is what I care the most about. I want to see who's using the system, how they're using it, what is working, what is not, what is failing, at what point. Your dashboards for me are your friends, and you start looking at it very early, the moment you start pushing code out, right? And then another little thing I like to do during the deployment phase is I make sure that I'm available for every hot and every PIR. I love to just sit in and understand what went wrong. How did they discover it? How long did it take to recover? Because those are like mental notes that you can find solutions to incorporate into the design and architecture again.
Yeah, I
Yeah,
would
yeah.
definitely add to that, like with like automation, right? Like, and again, like going back to my point earlier around like the software services side, you'd be surprised like how automation is not thought of like right from the get-go. Like a lot of these things that we are discussing, like you will benefit greatly like with automation. Like one is that like it would cut down on like human error significantly. Like you are kind of basically letting like a process kind of take that responsibility over and know it's going to be consistent. And that is something like you should definitely kind of encourage teams to do or like drive that whole conversations as early as possible.
Roshan, you brought amazing 2 points I want to touch a little bit more on. Is one thing you mentioned about metrics. One important thing that in my experience sometimes missed out is the cost. So, as an architect, you're responsible to basically check on the cost, because there were cases. One example is one architect designed everything around BigQuery, for example, but it was so expensive because the BigQuery was not tuned up properly, and then it skyrocketed. Just wanted to mention that as an architect, the buck stops with you. If solution needs to be found, there's nobody else you can ask other than finding the solution yourself. And the other thing is about being part of the deployment. I also find it very warming that if the architect being with the team to deploy it together and have that visceral feeling that this is my solution, I want to see it work. I think that makes a big difference.
Just tiny thing you mentioned, and Anjana touched upon this. He said capacity planning for people, right? Your engineers. You capacity plan for a deployment too, right? What kind of servers they're going to use. You come up with a plan. How do you scale? Do you scale up or do you scale out, right? All that contributes to I mean, it's such a complex. We can keep talking about this. There's so much to think about. But on that, let's share with our viewers our own, things that we think about when we are doing architecture, and then our own principles or theories that we are mindful of. I'm happy to go first. You may have heard me say this, but things that I always think about: leverage platform, one, encourage cross team collaboration from the get go, bring them into your design thinking very early. What this means is that everyone has a fingerprint in the architecture, right? So that means you want to encourage decoupled systems that have very strong, clear boundaries and strong APIs and contracts in how you interact, so they can be developed independently. So that is something very important to me. What about you guys?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, like most of those, like I definitely keep part of my toolkit. Just to add a few additional things, I strongly feel that like strong process is a key driver, right? Like so, I'm a stickler for it. Like sometimes, like I kind of enforce it across like teams, or like enforce is probably the wrong term, but like you kind of encourage like teams to do that across things like any kind of standard guides, right? Like you define them up front, because what you don't want to happen is like you're not following like a certain standard, and then you go and like refactor the code across like multiple developers, like such a waste of time. That's like one, right? Yeah, and another point is around the process, kind of documentation and unit test type of things to happen alongside, right? Like you don't use it as like a future state or like a future phase. Like if you're talking about like development, your unit test should be part of like that capacity planning, right? Like if you're talking purely from like an agile point of view, whatever you do in sprint one, unit tests have to, I'm using it as an example, but your unit test should be part of sprint one. It is not going to be part of sprint two. Documentation, you should leave room like for documentation, because the more you delay it, you will forget about things, and like suddenly, for example, like a spot review comes into picture, and now everyone is scrambling to create documents, right? And like your development comes to a halt. Like I have been in so many different teams that have run into these types of situations, so I have learned from those types of situations. And like whenever I start like a new project, I kind of bring these standards into picture, saying that like these are the things that you need to plan for, and that goes like for like the capacity planning.
Cool. So, some of the tools and techniques, I'll start with two things that has worked for me, especially when you work with multiple architects. When you're in a setup where there are multiple architects, we maintain something called ADR, Architectural Decision Record. Very simple, a log of all the decisions and why you took that decision. It's a justification of it. So that you don't go into a rabbit hole of later, why is this done this way or the other, and your sort of justification at that point of time. And sometimes I go through my own ADRs, and then it's like a refresher, and that helps me to keep on track. Um, and also, if a ADR is not done properly, if the decision is not done properly, I know there could be a problem in the system because I haven't really designed that designed enough in that, because sometimes you have to make quick decisions, like, so your area does not have all the options that you need to consider. You start with one or two and then move on. That's one thing, the decision law that keeps the history and the journey from a architect's point of view of the project. The other angle is more of the something that I encourage, and something that most of the architects don't get a chance to do it. If you're starting a project, or if you are working at a technical product, do the thin slice by yourself. Build the tiniest front end, connect it to a service, connect it to the middleware, whatnot. Do the tiniest slice and feel it like a dog food. Like you use your own design and experience that. Understand that pain that what the developers have to go through, or the pleasure that they have to go through. So in other words, this is called DX, developer experience. Feel it. Get a taste of that. That's very important as an architect. So if it's a technical product, it's easy to do. But if it's a solution architecture, like a very high level solution architecture, try some of the integrations. Look at some of the performance. Do something and get that experience. That's one way to get better at it. To get better at designing something much better. Yeah.
Yeah, seeing actual data versus mock data has a very big difference.
I can mention about principles, right? Drawing up on personal experience, keeping an open mind, because sometimes we get pulled into our own biases, like we have preferred way of doing things. But we, as an architect, you really need to look at what is the skill set of the team who is going to build this in many angles. The other is to Roshan's point, and others also mentioned, is that read, and lots of YouTube and trying yourself. Get some demo account and try it. And also, last thing I would mention is I personally found the open group architecture framework TOGAF. There are tons of tools, lots of patterns. There are a lot of minds put together to solve issues. Don't try to think that you need to come up with ideas yourself. There are lots of resources out there to use.
Yeah, I would add like Zachman to that too. Like there's like a lot of good resources across like these two frameworks.
Cool. Maybe wrap up there. Good conversation. Thanks.